Hi everyone, it's great that you've joined us and welcome to this, the 11th and the penultimate session in our series on Ephesians. These are short, accessible teachings on Paul's New Testament letter written to Christians in Ephesus to help them become established in their faith. As we've worked our way through this letter, we've highlighted three aspects for successful Christian living. We've referred to them as sitting, of walking and standing. And today, at last, we get to see why we need to stand, as Paul exhorts Christians then, as I'm sure he would now, to understand that we're engaged in a spiritual battle, a battle which is vast, subtle and ferocious. I find this passage intriguing. Perhaps it's the boy in me, which revels in the imagery of this cosmic battle. Though another part of me finds the imagery in the language harder to make sense of in contemporary society. These issues aside, there is something of real significance here that Paul was bringing to the attention of New Testament Christians, which I hope we too will be able to decipher and apply to our lives. At the heart of Paul's teaching is this reality that all Christians are engaged in spiritual warfare between good and evil, which is vast in its scale, subtle in its means, and ferocious in nature. It's only the naive amongst us that will ignore Paul's warning because, as elsewhere in Scripture, the battle we're engaged in is not against some vague alien force, but it's against a personal spiritual being, the devil, whose aim is to destroy every human being. We will do well to note this for ourselves, lest we think that this is simply for others, because the greatest potential for casualties is in those who believe the battle is going on elsewhere. So let's read from the Bible, from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through to 13. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armour of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. I wonder what you think about spiritual warfare and the idea that there's a battle raging between good and evil, between God and the devil. In summary, the Bible teaches that behind the power of good in this world there lies goodness himself, that is God, whilst directly or indirectly behind the evil seen around us is evil personified, the devil or Satan. For some people, because there is so much evil in the world and throughout history, whether that's evil or brutal, corrupt and immoral practice on a scale unimaginable from a merely human perspective, they find it easier to believe in the devil than in God. Perhaps they relate well to William Peter Blatty, who wrote and produced The Exorcist, and who said this: "As far as God goes, I am a non-believer. But when it comes to the devil, well, that is something else. The devil keeps advertising. The devil does lots of commercials." Though for many, and I think perhaps in the West, the reverse appears true, and they find the idea of a belief in the devil more difficult to believe than belief in God. If the idea of God as a white kind of bearded man sitting on a cloud is absurd, so is the idea of a horned devil trudging through Dante's Inferno. Similarly for Christians, I think they can fall into one of two different extremes. For some, the idea of spiritual warfare is difficult to grasp because they've been taught to downplay the supernatural at the expense of the rational or the physical or the observable. For them, spiritual warfare is so low on the agenda it barely causes a raised eyebrow. And although life throws all sorts of difficulties at them, such as habitual behavioural patterns, maybe quick temper or difficulty forgiving others or poor self-image or generational patterns of behaviour, for them this is just normal and something to be endured and maybe prayed about if it becomes particularly troublesome. The opposite extreme then is that some Christians take an unhealthy interest in spiritual things, so that many, if not all events in life are viewed through the spectacles of this cosmic battle. And for example, they're the reason why a person is late to work on a Monday morning, or that they lost their temper with their kids. It's this spiritual battle that's going on. It might be nothing to do with the fact that they just went to bed too late the night before. An excessive and unhealthy interest in such things is not helped by what we're seeing in society today. Society has a huge interest in spiritualism, in palm reading, Ouija boards, channeling, astrology, horoscopes, witchcraft, occult powers and the like. Involvement in these things is expressly forbidden in Scripture. And for those who've meddled in such things, I would urge you to receive prayer for healing. Now, I've portrayed two extremes, and the key in all of this is that we ask for godly wisdom and discernment throughout. So why should we believe in the devil? I'd like to offer 3 reasons. Firstly, because the Bible does. The biblical worldview is that behind the evil in the world there is the devil. The Greek word for the devil, diabolos, is translated from the Hebrew Satan. Now, although the Bible doesn't major on the devil, there are several references to Satan in the Old Testament, as a fallen angel, for instance, or as a personal spiritual being. The doctrine is developed more fully in the New Testament, particularly in the life of Jesus, where we see him tempted by the devil in the wilderness before he began his ministry. And throughout Jesus' ministry, he delivered people from demonic powers. There are references to the devil elsewhere in the New Testament. For instance, in 1 Peter we read of the Christian is told to be self-controlled and alert because your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that Christians down the ages have almost invariably believed in the existence of the devil. For example, the early church theologians, the reformers, the great evangelists like Wesley and Whitefield. And overwhelmingly, the majority of men and women of God have believed that the devil exists. My own personal experience is that within months of conversion, I met a fellow student who spoke openly about their upbringing in a family whose father was a Satanist and for whom spiritual warfare was a very real and present issue. And the third reason, our common sense surely confirms the existence of a devil. A theology that ignores the existence of a personal devil has a great deal to explain. Evil regimes, mass murders, terrorist atrocities, etc. Surely the most logical explanation is that the devil is behind this. So we need to know what this enemy is like. The world we live in is not neutral. Rather, the biblical worldview is of this battle between good and evil, between God and the devil or Satan. Now, here are 3 observations about the enemy that we had from our reading earlier. The first one is this: the battleground is vast. The battleground we're talking about encompasses not just our own sphere of interest, but the entire heavenly realm, so that our battle is not simply against flesh and blood, but instead it's against rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, and forces of evil. Although we are just one tiny part of the action, it is important to recognize the wider perspective of what is going on. Now, this wider perspective is of course oblivious to many people, and we shouldn't be that surprised by this. You read, for instance, in 2 Corinthians that the God of this age has blinded the mind of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the glory of the gospel of Christ. They don't see what's going on. But the reality is this: the devil's ultimate aim is to destroy every human being. In John 10 verse 10 we read, the thief, referring to the devil, comes only to steal, kill and destroy. Jesus, in contrast, says that he has come that they might have life and have it to the full. The devil tries to get us to follow a path that leads to destruction and to prevent anybody from coming to faith in Jesus Christ. And so for them, many people, they just don't have any real recognition of the work of Satan. The second point is that the battle is subtle. The battle is rarely right in our face or appears evil until it has accomplished its goal. The devil tries to gain entrance into our life by appearing attractive or desirable and perfectly legitimate. It is akin to being in a room which begins pure white and which, unbeknown to you, each night a painter comes in and paints it a tint of grey, just off-white. And so every time it becomes slightly darker until with time you realise that the room is actually grey. The battle lines are rarely visible physical disasters. Rather, they're battles over issues of personal integrity and morality, of dealing with issues of guilt and shame, of fear, anxiety and worry. And the battle is almost always more apparent in those who want to leave behind their life of sin. These are the people the devil is more interested in. And the tactics of Satan are not new, and they usually follow a recognisable pattern. This is well illustrated in the account of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, where we see Satan personified by the serpent, raising doubts in the mind of the believer by undermining the truth of God, of using deception to make God's ways appear diminished and prohibitive, and tempting the believer to bring about their disobedience to God's ways. The third point is the battle is ferocious. Should we be surprised by the veracity of some of the battles that we encounter? Simply bear in mind that Satan is filled with fury because the final outcome has already been decided and his time is short. Look up Revelation for that. A parallel has been drawn between what Christians experience living between the first and second comings of Jesus with what happened in World War II between D-Day and VE Day. There, although the final outcome was almost assured, some of the most fierce fighting took place between these two dates. So let me end with a final charge. Where does all this leave us? It is possible to stand and be victorious because of the Lord's mighty power. We saw that in Ephesians 6 verse 10. It is possible to stand and be victorious because of the Lord's mighty power. Hence, it is crucial to understand our position as Christians in relation to the power of the devil. Now, if it would be helpful, why don't you revisit some of the opening sessions? Simply put, Satan is a conquered foe. And our subject for next week is that the resources that we need are there set before us. Our responsibility is to correctly take hold of them and wisely appropriate them so that we can stand, remembering that we're all engaged in a battle that is vast, subtle, and ferocious.